From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Vice President Kamala Harris goes on a media blitz proposing an expansion of Medicare and being pressed on how she'd pay for her policies, while former President Donald Trump passes on an interview with 60 Minutes. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Bill McGurn. In a visit Tuesday to the TV show The View, Kamala Harris proposed a new entitlement expansion for home health care. Listen to this.
There are so many people in our country who are right in the middle. They're taking care of their kids and they're taking care of their aging parents. And it's just almost impossible to do it all. So what I am proposing is that basically what we will do is allow Medicare to cover in-home health care. People say, well, how are you going to pay for it? Here's the thing. Here's how we pay for it. Part of what I also intend to do is allow Medicare to continue to negotiate drug prices against these big pharmaceutical companies.
Alicia, this is a proposal for what Kamala Harris is calling the sandwich generation, taking care of children as well as aging parents. What is she proposing, and are there more details here? Has she put out any cost estimates, for example, or is what we have basically what she said on The View?
What we have is basically what she said on The View. Now, progressives have floated this idea of a home health care entitlement. It actually didn't make its way into the Build Back Better plan, in part because it was incredibly expensive. On average, home health care for a senior will cost about $288,000. Medicaid does cover home health care for indigent and disabled seniors. However, Medicare does not. So this would be a new Medicare entitlement. The costs that I've seen have run between around $50 to anywhere to $200 billion a year. So now you understand why it wasn't even included in the $5 trillion Build Back Better plan. Would have squeezed out almost any other entitlements. Again, she doesn't raise or even mention the cost. She suggests that she'll pay for it by allowing Medicare to continue to negotiate drug prices with drug makers. If you recall, the Inflation Reduction Act created these kind of sham negotiations between the government and drug makers. And basically, the government sets a price and the drug makers aren't allowed to refuse it. Otherwise, they get slapped with an excise fee that's essentially would put them out of business. It's almost nearly 2,000%. The problem is, one, these drug price controls create a disincentive to develop treatments. And we're already seeing that. And actually, drug makers are slashing spending on research and development. So that's a policy concern. The second is it really doesn't raise that much money. Even in the first round, a lot of the analysts were saying that actually the savings that the government claimed that they will get from these negotiations actually isn't even close to what the CBO was projecting. And CBO was projecting about $150 billion over 10 years. Okay, that doesn't come close to paying for a nearly $2 trillion entitlement. If you were to expand these drug price negotiations, you still wouldn't get close to paying for this new entitlement.
And by the way, Medicare is one of these programs that already has fiscal challenges coming relatively soon down the pike because of the ratio of the number of workers to the number of retirees and older Americans has been going down all the time. If you check the Medicare Trustees 2024 report, it says that the year of asset depletion is now projected to be 2036, at which point the hospital insurance revenues are projected to cover 89% of incurred program costs. And that date, that go broke date, moves around a bit as the tax revenues change, as the economic situation in the United States changes, whether it's in a recession or an expansion. In recent reports, it has been pushed back. But still, Bill, 2036, in the grand scheme of American history and presidencies, is not that far down the road. And instead of talking about reform to these programs, one thing that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump both agree on is that there will be no changes to Medicare or Social Security, and yet they're even talking about expansions to these programs.
Yeah, exactly. Look, the whole question is kind of dishonest. Even when 60 Minutes asked her, how would you pay for it? It's not Kamala Harris paying for it. Kamala Harris is not going to pay for it. The better question is, how are the American people going to pay for this? And it comes in two forms, either higher taxes to raise the revenue or inflation. And we just jumble all these numbers. The reason Kamala Harris didn't spell it out, she doesn't need to. She just wants to get through these interviews. It described as a media blitz, avoiding the press for like 2 months, and then suddenly in less than a month before the election having these interviews. This is just to get her through to the November election. After that, I expect we'll see a tougher press corps saying her numbers don't add up and so forth, for all the reasons Alicia pointed out. But this is really a very cynical exercise in not answering the questions, but in filling up the space with certain pat rhetoric like fair share. And if we've learned anything from history of the last, 40 years, it's that fair share means more. Whatever the rate is, it means we want more.
Let's listen to that clip that Bill mentions. This is Vice President Harris on 60 Minutes being asked about how she plans to pay for the proposals that she's putting out during this 2024 presidential campaign.
Small businesses are part of the backbone of America's economy.
But pardon me, Madam Vice President, the question was, how are you going to pay for it?
Well, one of the things is I'm going to make sure that the richest among us who can afford it pay their fair share in taxes. It is not right that teachers and nurses and firefighters are paying a higher tax rate than billionaires and the biggest corporations. And I plan on making that fair.
But we're dealing with the real world here.
But the real world includes...
How are you going to get this through Congress?
When you talk quietly with a lot of folks in Congress, they know exactly what I'm talking about because their constituents know exactly what I'm talking about. Their constituents are those firefighters and teachers and nurses.
Alicia, a lot of angles to go at there, including that last bit about the idea that there's a silent majority in Congress just waiting to pass some kind of enormous tax increases. But on the bit specifically about this fair share and what billionaires are paying versus what teachers and firefighters are paying, I think she's just not correct about that. You can go look at information put out by the IRS. The Tax Foundation every year does a pretty good write-up on it. And the 2021 IRS data say that taxpayers between the bottom half and the top 25%, so people that are earning between about $47,000 and about $95,000 a year, their average tax rate was 7%. If you go up, so the cohort between the top 25 and top 10%, those are people with earnings up to about $170,000. Their average tax rate is 10%. And then if you go up to the top 1%, these are people earning above about $680,000. Their average tax rate is 26%. And so if you look at these figures, there may be people who in an individual year lose a lot of money, or tax credits that they're taking have reasons to pay a low tax rate. But on average, this idea that billionaires are getting some sort of special exemption that is allowing them to pay lower tax rates than your average teacher, I think just is not borne out by the data.
Right. So I think what they're trying to allude to is the fact is a lot of the income for high earners, the very, billionaires, comes from capital gains, and they pay a 23.8% tax rate on capital gains, which is lower than the top marginal rate for some, middle class or upper middle class folks. But of course, the average rate is very different than the marginal rate. And most middle class people do not pay their average rate. Their effective rate is not the top rate. And so you just basically laid out the statistics showing that, in fact, that the billionaires do pay a higher share of their income in taxes than the lower earners, middle class. And the other reality is that the top 1% pay about 46% of all income tax. The bottom 50% only pay about 2.3%. So it's a pretty lopsided. And then if you want another statistic that further disproves Harris's point, the top 1% pay $1 trillion in income. Now, think about all these new entitlements that she's pitching. And as I said earlier, this new one could cost easily a couple $1 trillion. So you're basically saying that the top 1% is going to have to pay double what they are currently, and they are currently paying 45% of all income tax. tax. So are you expecting them to pay 90% of all income tax? I mean, that's a rough calculation, right? But you can only squeeze so much blood out of the orange, and you're going to create all kinds of distortions in terms of capital, encouraging new tax shelters probably, but you're just not going to be able to get that much more money out of the rich. And this is why revenues as a share of GDP, no matter what the top rate has been, recall it was much higher in the 70s before the Reagan tax cuts, the revenues as a share of GDP have always been around 17 to 18%.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. By the way, this conversation is coming as the Congressional Budget Office on Tuesday released its September monthly budget review. This one now covers the whole of the fiscal year that ended on September 30. And the top line number, Bill, is pretty ugly. The federal budget deficit for fiscal 2024, $1.83 trillion. That is the second year in a row of a roughly $2 trillion annual deficit. And the more you look into these numbers, the worse they get. The spending on interest payments on the debt was $950 billion, bigger than the entire defense budget, bigger than Medicare spending. And there's not really, as far as I can tell, any real conversation in this presidential election, these debates about how are we going to reckon with this problem that we're having. It seems like both of these candidates are simply focused on offering more promises, whether it is this expansion of Medicare or no taxes on tips from President Trump, no taxes on Social Security benefits. That's another one of the things he keeps bringing up at his rallies. And this is at a time when the U.S. is not engaged in a major war. We're not in a recession. And Bill, we're talking about $2 trillion a year going into the hole every year.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that the liberals would complain about the deficit, the effect on the deficit of giving tax cuts. In other words, letting people keep more of their own money. That's all out the window now. They don't seem to care. It's just spending. And, the government is on spending spree and no one seems to watch it. The logic of Kamala Harris's answer about billionaires paying a lower proportion of their income in taxes than the teachers and firemen. The logic is really a flat tax. Solve that all with the flat tax. I lived under a flat tax in Hong Kong for 10 years, and it was wonderful. 15%. And you could fill out your taxes really in 10 minutes. It was like 2 pages. But they'll never do that because they want to fund the government. They don't want to leave people alone. Even the small business thing that Kamala Harris is focused on, it polls well. People always like small businesses. So it polls well. But they'd be far better off with the deregulatory agenda and lower tax rates. They know how to do their own business. They would thrive. But that's never the way. It's always about taking money from some set of taxpayers and giving it to others. And you kind of intimated this, but I don't know if you spelled it out. But when they say the rich, there's not enough money among the rich, however they define it, to fund all they want. So that means they have to go lower down and start hitting the middle class, the people between rich and poor. And that's why they always suffer most from these high spending programs. And, right now we're just going to get the promised benefit and no one's paying attention to costs. But in January, whoever is elected, those issues will start come to play. It won't be that easy to get this stuff through Congress.
What about the politics here? Alicia, after being criticized for not doing interviews, after being handed essentially the Democratic presidential nomination, in recent days, Kamala Harris has not only been on The View, she has gone on with Howard Stern, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, she's gone on podcasts. And it seems to be an effort to put the candidate out there. Let's listen to her respond when asked about whether voters know her. This is again on 60 Minutes.
A quarter of registered voters still say they don't know you. They don't know what makes you tick. And why do you think that is? What's the disconnect?
It's an election, Bill. And I take it seriously that I have to earn everyone's vote. This is an election for President of the United States. No one should be able to take for granted that they can just declare themselves a candidate and automatically receive support. You have to earn it. And that's what I intend to do.
Alicia, do you think this is going to have a positive effect for her campaign, even if she is not really answering in detail some of these questions? How would you pay for her policies? Does it help to have her out there sharing a beer with Stephen Colbert, even if to some voters she looks like she is dodging the real policy issues?
Well, I think that there are a couple problems here. First, is she isn't being honest and candid. She's dancing around questions. And this tends to reinforce the impression that many voters have that she isn't being honest with them, that she's trying to cover something up or trying to hide something. So doing more of these interviews when she actually doesn't actually state clear positions, or when she equivocates, or in many cases also prevaricates, I don't think that really helps. She isn't really laying out anything new here. A lot of the stuff, she's speaking in platitudes. A lot of this stuff she says feels very vacuous. And that, again, reinforces an impression that voters already have that maybe she's pretty skin deep. She hasn't studied things in detail, or just doesn't explain things very well, or she just doesn't really know what she thinks about things, none of which are actually good. I think the other problem is that she's mostly just doing, softball interviews with friendly interviewers, friendly formats, putting aside the 60 Minutes interview where she actually was prodded on some questions, as we heard earlier. But why is she doing these formats? Because she doesn't want to actually answer any hardball questions or be pushed. And I think that doesn't reflect well upon her. And I think voters can pick that up. Voters are not stupid. The way she's conducting her campaign, to be honest, seems a little arrogant. And I think some voters are sensing that as well.